Hi, I'm Sharla. I bought an $85,000 BMW as a surprise birthday gift for my husband. And the same night, I walked in on him, in our bed, with my best friend. But that's not the worst part. I overheard them whispering, planning to take everything. Not just my house, not just my savings, me. And for a moment, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I listened. And what I heard, it shattered everything I believed about love, loyalty, and family. You think betrayal is loud? Sometimes it's so quiet it rots you from the inside out. But I didn't collapse. I watched, I waited, and what I did next? Well, let's just say it wasn't what they expected. Before we dive in, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. Because tonight, you're not just hearing a story, you're stepping into the moment I stopped being their victim. The late afternoon sun settled low across the cul-de-sac, stretching gold across the kitchen floor. Outside, the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower sputtered, then died. I stood at the sink, drying my hands slowly with a dish towel that had thinned over years of use. There was a quiet to the house I'd come to expect around this hour. Nothing dramatic, just the rhythm of a weekday evening in a neighborhood where people ate dinner by 6. I glanced at the clock on the oven. 5:12 p.m. Still plenty of time before he got home. I folded the towel and laid it across the handle. The counters were already clean, dinner was halfway prepped, and the living room, as usual, looked untouched. I turned toward the hallway, paused, and walked to the coat rack. Slipping my hand into the pocket of my trench coat, I found the small, cool object right where I'd left it. The key fob was smooth, heavy, with just the slightest click when I pressed it. I didn't press it now, I just held it. I hadn't told anyone, not my sister, not my coworkers, not even him, especially not him. A few days earlier, I'd walked into the BMW dealership in Plano wearing jeans, my hair in a ponytail. I could tell they thought I was just browsing, maybe wasting their time, but the money was already sitting in a separate account. I'd been setting it aside for years, not for this specifically, but for something that felt worth it. And that day, when I saw the car, sleek, dark blue, just enough power under the hood without screaming, I knew. It wasn't about luxury, it was about giving something unexpected to someone I thought I knew better than anyone else. I signed the paperwork, shook the man's hand, and slipped the fob into my coat like it was a secret worth keeping close. It wasn't about the car, it was about the silence that came with not needing a thank you. We'd been married 17 years. I was the one who handled the bills, remembered to schedule the roof inspection, made sure the fridge never ran out of milk. He once called me the glue, and I wore that like a quiet badge, was dependable. I didn't need surprises or flowers, but I wanted to give them. A few minutes later, I set the table, 2 plates, 1 glass of iced tea, 1 of water, and moved the roast to the oven. The air filled with rosemary and garlic, warm and grounding. I changed into a clean blouse and dabbed a little foundation under my eyes, then laughed softly at myself. I wasn't dressing up, I just wanted to feel ready. The front door opened around 6:07. I heard his keys drop into the bowl by the entryway, followed by the shuffle of his shoes on the mat. "Char," he called, his voice trailing into the hallway. "In the kitchen," I said, wiping my hands again. He walked in, loosening his tie with one hand, and planted a kiss on my cheek, distracted. "Smells good," he said, grabbing a piece of carrot off the counter and popping it into his mouth. I smiled. "Glad you're home." He sighed, pulled out a chair, and sat with a groan. "Long day. Larry messed up the quarterly report again. I swear, if I have to explain margins one more time, I'll just do the whole thing myself." I nodded, listening. He launched into a rundown of his day, commute, emails, Someone in the office bringing store-bought cookies and claiming they were homemade. He laughed. I smiled again. He didn't ask about mine. He didn't say anything about the date or the little card I'd left in his drawer that morning. He didn't see the fresh flowers on the table either. I told myself maybe he didn't notice the calendar. Maybe he didn't remember that today, 17 years ago, we had our first coffee at that diner in Abilene, the one that doesn't even exist anymore. It wasn't our anniversary, exactly, but it mattered to me, and he used to know that. He reached for the remote and turned on the game while I plated the food. I placed his plate in front of him, sat across, and asked about the rest of his week. He answered between bites. We didn't talk about much else. I didn't mention it. I didn't ask if he got the card. I didn't say, "Do you remember?" I just watched the way he chewed, the way his eyes stayed on the screen, and I tucked it down like I've done 100 times before. Somewhere during cleanup, I caught myself humming. A habit from childhood, something I did when I didn't want to think too hard. I loaded the dishwasher, wiped the counters again, and paused at the coat rack. My fingers found the key fob again. I held it, pressed it once in my palm, then slipped it into my purse instead of putting it back. It was silly. Just a car. Just a gift. Still, I didn't want to leave it hanging on the hook anymore. When he came into the bedroom later that night, he kissed my shoulder, climbed into bed, and turned to face the wall. I lay there with the covers pulled to my chest, wide awake. His breathing deepened quickly. He always slept like a log. I stared at the ceiling. Something in me buzzed. At some point, I turned to face him, and that's when I noticed it. His phone, face down, but still lit up just enough for me to see a notification flash and disappear. That was normal, I told myself. Nothing to think twice about. I rolled onto my back and took a long breath. Maybe it really was nothing, but that night, for the first time, I didn't leave my keys in the bowl by the door. By morning, the keys were still in my purse, nestled beneath a packet of tissues and an old grocery list. I hadn't touched them since slipping them in the night before, but somehow, just knowing they were there made me feel steadier. The kitchen was awash in soft yellow light. I moved around it the same way I always did, pouring coffee, cracking 2 eggs into the skillet, turning the bacon just before it crisped too much. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the ticking clock above the window. Everything looked normal. That was the strange part. He came down just after 7, same as always, tie still unknotted around his neck and his phone in his hand. He mumbled a good morning, kissed my cheek absently, and sat down at the table. I slid his plate in front of him and poured his coffee just how he liked it. 2 sugars, splash of cream, never stirred. As I sat across from him, I hesitated before speaking. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, not looking up. "You?" "Fine," I replied, even though I'd barely slept. I sipped my coffee, waiting for him to ask something, anything, but he didn't. There was a pause, then I tried again. "Last night, I thought I heard your phone buzz a couple times. Everything all right at work?" He didn't flinch. He glanced up, smiling just slightly. "Yeah, probably just a few emails. You know how it is. People in Singapore forget the time difference." His tone was even, pleasant. "You're always noticing little things." I nodded slowly. "Guess I do." "You worry too much sometimes," he said gently, cutting into his eggs. "That's what makes you so good at what you do, though. Always thinking ahead." I smiled, but something in me shifted. It was the way he said it, so calm, so measured, like he was complimenting me and dismissing me at the same time. "I wasn't worried," I said lightly, brushing a crumb from the table. "Just asking." He reached across and touched my hand briefly. "And I love that about you." I nodded, suddenly feeling like I'd overstepped. I changed the subject, asked if he had a meeting that morning, and the moment passed. Later that day, after finishing some paperwork in my home office and dropping off a few things at the dry cleaner, I stopped by the grocery store for dinner ingredients. I passed the bakery aisle and, on impulse, picked up a small lemon tart, his favorite. A little peace offering, though I couldn't say what for. Back home, I prepped dinner early. The roast needed a few hours, and I wanted everything ready before he got home. As the oven warmed and the kitchen filled with the scent of rosemary again, I pulled out a small photo album from the drawer under the coffee table. It was an old one, the kind with pages that stick. I hadn't looked at it in years. Inside were pictures from our 10th anniversary trip to Oregon. I remembered how much I'd loved that little bed and breakfast. On the coast, the one with the white shutters and hydrangeas blooming out front. One picture caught my eye. We were standing in front of the cliffs, wind blowing through our jackets, and I was laughing. He'd taken it right before pretending to toss his phone into the sea, claiming it was the only way he could get away from work. When he got home that evening, he was on the phone. I waved, he mouthed, "Just a sec," and walked into the bedroom, still talking. I busied myself with dinner, setting the table, lighting a candle like I always did on Saturdays. When he finally emerged, he looked surprised. "Oh," he said, glancing at the table. "This looks fancy." "It's just roast. Thought I'd try the rosemary thing again." He smiled, kissed my forehead. "You're amazing." We sat down and the conversation was easy at first. He told me about a client call, some issue with a report. I nodded, asked questions, kept the rhythm going. Then, as he poured himself a second glass of wine, he mentioned something odd. "You know, I was telling Sam at work the other day about how I picked out that Oregon trip. Remember that?" I blinked. "Picked it out?" "Yeah, how I surprised you with it." I felt my fork pause mid-air. "Actually, I planned that trip. I found the inn, booked everything." He laughed. "Did you? Huh, I could have sworn I did." I smiled, but it felt tight. "I'm pretty sure." "Well," he shrugged. "Either way, it was great, right?" "Right," I said quietly, pushing food around on my plate. He changed the subject, talking about a new guy at the office who didn't know the difference between a fiscal year and a calendar year, and I let it go. But something about that moment stuck with me. Later, after dinner and the dishes and a rerun of a game show he liked, I folded laundry in the bedroom. He was in the living room, still watching TV, scrolling his phone in between commercial breaks. I paused, holding one of his button-downs, and looked toward my purse. I walked over, reached inside, and wrapped my fingers around the key fob. I wasn't planning to use it, I just needed to feel it there. The next afternoon, we had coffee with some friends from church. It was just 4 of us, sitting outside a cafe under an awning, laughing about old neighborhood gossip. At one point, one of them, Carla, brought up the fundraiser we helped plan last spring. "Charla practically ran the whole thing," she said. "She was like a machine. Remember the silent auction? You kept that whole thing from falling apart." I smiled, embarrassed, but he jumped in. "Oh, I just kept her organized. You know Char, she's great with ideas, but she gets scattered sometimes." There was laughter, light and easy, but something in me stilled. I hadn't been scattered. I'd printed the donation forms, made the spreadsheets, booked the venue. He'd made one call, to a friend of a friend who donated a bottle of wine. I said nothing, just sipped my coffee and smiled. Driving home, I watched the way his hand tapped the steering wheel, how he hummed along with the radio. I could have said something. I could have asked, "Why did you say that?" But I didn't, because what would that accomplish? A shrug, a chuckle, maybe even another, "You worry too much." And maybe I did. Maybe I always had. At the next red light, I slid my hand into my coat pocket and found the fob again. Lately, I was touching it more often, not pressing the button, just holding it, like it meant something I couldn't quite name. That night, after dinner, we sat on the couch watching a movie. Something light, forgettable. I laughed when I was supposed to, leaned against his shoulder, but my mind was elsewhere. At one point, he got up to get more popcorn. I caught the glance he gave his phone before leaving the room, the way he tilted it slightly so the screen wasn't visible. When he came back, I asked what I missed. "Nothing important," he said. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that looked like it had been practiced, like it had been waiting. I didn't say anything. I just watched him for a moment, then turned back to the screen. I didn't know what it meant yet. I only knew I had started paying attention. I'd started watching the way he walked into rooms. That was new. It was 2 days later, Tuesday, maybe Wednesday. I came home later than usual after an extra hour at the bookstore where I sometimes volunteered. I told myself I was helping sort inventory, but really, I just sat on a stool in the back room flipping through old cookbooks, delaying going home. The sun had already dipped, and our street was that dim kind of quiet where porch lights glow, but curtains stay shut. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed his car was parked just slightly crooked, one tire brushing the line of my side. Small detail. Still. Inside, the house was still. No TV hum, no clink of glass or footsteps upstairs. Just stillness. I slipped off my shoes and padded across the kitchen. His phone wasn't on the counter. No mail brought in. I called out a soft, "Hey, I'm home," but didn't wait for a reply. As I walked through the living room, I felt something strange. Not fear, just an alertness. Like something in the air had changed, and my body knew before my brain caught up. There was a faint sound upstairs, a murmur, a creak. The bedroom door was almost shut, just slightly cracked, enough to catch a sliver of lamplight slicing into the hallway. I hesitated at the bottom of the steps, not because I was scared, but because I suddenly didn't want to know. But I went up, one step, then another. The hall smelled like his cologne, sharp, too fresh, not how it usually lingered on his shirts, worn in, familiar. This was recent. I pushed the door open slowly. They didn't see me right away. He was propped up against the headboard, shirt off, legs tangled in the sheets. She was beside him, hair loose. That same shade of ash brown she always joked was her divorce color. My best friend, Leslie. She laughed at something he whispered, then turned her head and saw me. Her face didn't twist in guilt or panic. It just froze. Her mouth hung open a second too long. His eyes followed hers, and when he saw me, he didn't jump, didn't stumble. He just blinked. Once. Twice. "Charla," he said, like my name was a question. I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just looked. The room was still. The air didn't move. There was a glass of water on the nightstand, her sandal by the dresser, my scarf hanging from the chair, the one I'd been missing last week. I couldn't decide what hurt worse, the betrayal, or how undramatic it all felt, how ordinary. I didn't say a word. I just stood there. Seconds stretched. My heart wasn't racing. I didn't feel heat rise to my cheeks or tears sting my eyes. Everything was distant, like I was watching it happen to someone else. They didn't move. Maybe they were waiting for me to explode. Maybe they thought I would turn and leave. Instead, I listened. He said something low. Her response came softer, muffled, but I heard enough. "Wait until after her birthday." "She'll sign. Whatever. She doesn't even read the papers." Leslie's voice. "Just get the house in your name first. You promised. If you back out, I swear to God." That was when my knees stopped working properly. Not from heartbreak, from calculation. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a setup. I looked at the nightstand again, my photo in a frame. Our wedding picture still in its place. Her lipstick was smudged on the glass. I noted the detail, stored it. A ringing settled in my ears. Everything else dulled. And then, without meaning to, I remembered something my father once said. Years ago, standing by our porch, back when I was a teenager tangled up in some boy who told half-truths like breathing. He'd put a hand on my shoulder and said, "People who need to erase you to feel taller, those are the ones you watch closely. They'll smile while they move the ground under your feet." It wasn't advice, it was a warning. I took one last look at the two people on that bed, my husband, my best friend, and then I stepped back. Quietly, I pulled the door shut. I didn't slam it. I didn't ask why. Downstairs, I slipped on my shoes, grabbed my purse, took my keys out of the inside pocket where they'd been living lately. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the car door, breathing. I didn't cry that night. I did something worse. I started remembering everything. I don't remember driving home that night. I just remember the weight of the steering wheel in my hands and the sound of tires rolling over the same familiar cracks in the road. I didn't sleep, didn't cry, didn't even change clothes. I lay in bed with my eyes open until the gray light of morning slid across the ceiling like nothing had happened. By 7:30, I was in the driver's seat again, heading toward nowhere in particular. I ended up at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind with old tile floors and quiet regulars who don't ask questions. I parked in the far corner of the lot, away from the windows. Didn't want anyone I knew seeing me. Inside, I ordered black coffee, sat by the wall, and didn't touch the cup. People came in, laughed, flipped newspapers. The world moved on, like it always does. But inside me, something was moving differently now, slow, focused, colder than I'd ever felt before. I started replaying their voices in my head, not just what they did, what they said. "Wait until after her birthday. She'll sign whatever. Just get the house in your name first." The way they said it, it wasn't panicked. It wasn't some impulsive, heat-of-the-moment affair. It was planning, like I'd been a box to check off, a signature to collect. That's when I knew the betrayal wasn't the point. The goal wasn't cheating, it was erasure. The plan wasn't to leave me, it was to remove me. And I'd almost made it easy. I could see it so clearly now, how the little things had started to shift months ago. His sudden interest in refinancing the house. That one morning at breakfast, when he slid over a document and said, "Just the new insurance policy. Just sign it so I can get it out the door before work." I hadn't read it. I didn't even look at it. I was late for a dentist appointment. God, I wanted to throw that memory away, but it stayed, sharp, useful. I sat in that cafe until the lunch crowd started trickling in. I watched the waitress refill coffee without being asked, saw the way the regulars knew each other's names, and all I could think was how many people probably walked around every day with no idea that someone close to them was quietly taking a piece of their life apart. That was me. That was what was happening. And I'd been too polite, too trusting to see it. I pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, but to scroll back through old emails, texts, files. I started looking at everything with new eyes. Every update, every favor, every casual, "Hey, can you sign this?" It was like watching a puzzle flip upside down. The mortgage paperwork? "Just an addendum," he'd said, brushing toast crumbs off the table. "They need both names to process the change." I hadn't noticed that only his name showed on the second page. The car insurance policy? He told me it was just for the BMW, but he'd taken my name off the old one entirely. It wasn't messy. It wasn't angry. It was careful. That's what made it worse. I knew I should have called someone. My sister, maybe, or Pam from work. But something in me locked up. Not because I didn't want help, but because I didn't want pity. And I wasn't ready to cry. Not yet. I didn't want to be someone this happened to. So I didn't reach out. I just sat there, calm as the coffee in front of me, and I started making a list in my head. Not a list of people to blame. A list of what was mine and what they thought they could take. My name was still on the title. I still had the key fob in my coat pocket. The house, the car, the bank accounts, none of it was accidental. They'd been clearing the path slowly, methodically. But they weren't done, and neither was I. I walked out of that cafe without saying a word, got in my car, adjusted the mirror, and looked at my own face for the first time that day. I didn't look broken. I looked awake. Back in the driver's seat, I sat with the engine off for a while, listening to the tick of the cooling metal. I thought about how quiet betrayal can be. Not just the act, but the way it eats around the edges of your life until you barely recognize the shape of it anymore. And I made a quiet decision. This wasn't about marriage anymore. It wasn't about forgiveness. This was about theft. This was about survival. That was the moment I stopped asking why and started deciding what I would do next. It didn't take a grand plan, just a quiet decision. I drove back to the house that afternoon with my hands steady on the wheel, the kind of calm that isn't peaceful, just necessary. The sun was low, casting long shadows on the street, same as always. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalk. The neighbor's sprinkler ticked back and forth across their lawn. Everything looked so normal that it almost made me laugh. I parked in the driveway, same spot as always, and sat for a moment before opening the door. My fingers brushed the key fob in my pocket out of habit. I walked inside. The house smelled faintly of whatever candle I'd left burning last, something vanilla and safe. There were shoes by the front door, his jacket over the chair, a plate in the sink. All the fingerprints of a shared life, still warm. But I wasn't there for sentiment. I went upstairs, opened the closet, and pulled out the overnight bag I hadn't used in years. I moved through the room like I was tracing muscle memory. Folded clothes, zipped compartments, charger, toothbrush. I didn't bother with framed pictures or keepsakes. Not because they didn't matter, but because they did, and I couldn't carry that weight. I didn't leave a note, didn't slam a door, didn't even lock it behind me. I walked out with my bag and my silence, same way I'd walked through every hard thing in that marriage, measured, composed, invisible. The sun was dipping past the rooftops as I drove toward the edge of town. I checked into a small hotel tucked behind a gas station, the kind where no one asks questions if you pay in cash. The clerk didn't look up when he handed me the key. Room 214. Inside, the curtains were stiff, the comforter a dull floral. But it was clean, quiet, mine. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall for a long time, not thinking, just letting the silence stretch. Eventually, my mind drifted. Not to him, but to us. To all the moments that had made no sense before, but were suddenly glaringly clear. The expensive earrings he'd given me after that shouting match about his late nights. The weekend in Austin, right after I'd threatened to leave. The spa gift card he tucked into my purse after I found that strange charge on his card and asked about it. It hadn't been kindness, it had been currency, a pattern disguised as romance. Every "I'm sorry" had a price tag. Every conflict had a receipt. He didn't fix things, he paid them off, and I accepted it. Not because I was naive, but because somewhere along the way, I'd started trading peace for presence. I knew how he worked, and I worked around it. I learned when to speak and when to be quiet, when to act hurt and when to let it slide. Because love, or what I thought was love, felt safer than being alone. And now, sitting in a dim hotel room with that cheap art print on the wall, I saw the truth clearer than ever. I had trained him, taught him that I could be quieted with gifts, conditioned him to believe that silence was my form of agreement. I let shame sit beside me on the bed. I didn't fight it, I didn't excuse it, but I didn't drown in it either. At some point, the sky turned black behind the curtains, and I hadn't eaten all day. I unwrapped a granola bar from my purse, chewed slowly, then tossed the wrapper in the trash with deliberate aim. I undressed, took a hot shower, let the water beat against my back until my fingers pruned. Then I put on a worn t-shirt and sat on the edge of the bed again. It wasn't until I reached into my coat pocket for the charger that I felt the key fob. I pulled it out, turned it in my hand. The gift he didn't know I'd given. I'd bought that car to surprise him. A gesture years in the making. Saved, planned, meant to be a symbol of everything we'd built together. Now it just felt heavy. I set it down on the nightstand, didn't look at it too long. Something about it had changed. Or maybe something in me had. I pulled the covers up, switched off the lamp, and lay on my side facing the window. I thought leaving would make me feel smaller. Instead, it showed me how much of myself I had been giving away. I didn't feel lighter after that realization. I felt clearer. There's a difference. Lightness can fade. Clarity stays, even when it hurts. The morning came quietly. No alarm, no rush. The thin hotel curtains let in a pale stripe of sun that cut across the carpet. I sat up on the edge of the bed, feet on the floor, hands resting on my knees. The coffee cup sat untouched on the desk, already going lukewarm. I didn't need it yet. My body was tired, but my mind had finally stopped spinning. For the first time in days, I wasn't replaying scenes. I was sorting them. I showered, dressed simply, and gathered my things. Before leaving, I stood still for a moment, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the muted sounds of traffic outside. Nothing dramatic. Just the sound of a day beginning without me in the middle of it. That was when I started retracing the past with a different lens. Not memories of love, memories of paperwork. I thought about how often my husband had handled details for us. Taxes, insurance renewals, title updates. He always said it was easier if one person stayed on top of it. I had trusted that. It wasn't laziness, it was partnership. Or so I believed. As I drove, things lined up that hadn't before. Casual conversations about cleaning things up. That time he'd asked me to sign something quickly because he was running late. The way he'd said, "It's nothing new, just keeping things current." I remembered dates, the order of events, how certain requests came right after arguments or just before big purchases. None of it screamed danger on its own. Together, it formed a shape I didn't like. I parked outside a small law office mid-morning. Nothing fancy. Brick building, a modest sign out front, cars angled neatly in the lot. Inside, the air smelled like paper and old coffee. The receptionist was polite but uncurious. I appreciated that. The attorney spoke carefully, measured words, no promises. He listened, nodded, asked clarifying questions. When he explained options, they came with timelines, procedures, waiting. "You need to be patient," he said gently. "Moving too fast can make things worse." I understood exactly what he meant. Emotionally charged decisions can backfire. Paperwork doesn't care how hurt you are. Courts don't reward urgency. They reward order. Still, as I sat there, hands folded in my lap, something pressed against my chest. Patience had cost me already. I thanked him, took notes, and walked back to my car. I sat there longer than necessary, the steering wheel cool beneath my palms. I wasn't rejecting the advice. I was weighing it against something no one else could calculate. The cost of waiting. Waiting had been my default for years. Waiting for things to improve. Waiting for explanations that never came. Waiting for apologies that arrived wrapped in distractions. This time I chose a middle ground. I wouldn't blow things up, but I wouldn't stay still either. On the way back to the hotel, I pulled over into a grocery store parking lot. I sat there with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen longer than needed. Then I made the call. the dealership answered on the second ring. Friendly voice, professional. "I need to pause a delivery," I said. My voice didn't shake, though my pulse kicked hard. "Yes, that one. I'll explain later." There was a brief pause on the other end, then confirmation. Polite, efficient. Just like that, a line had been drawn. No confrontation, no accusations, no announcement. A boundary enforced quietly. I ended the call and sat there, phone resting on my thigh. My hands trembled, just a little. I let them. Then I took a breath and felt them settle. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to stop losing without realizing it. That afternoon, I drove aimlessly for a while. Past neighborhoods that looked like mine, past strip malls and stoplights, and people carrying on with their errands. Life continued. That was strangely comforting. The world hadn't ended because I changed my behavior. In the early evening, I parked near a small park and stayed in the car, watching the sky shift colors. My thoughts weren't racing anymore. They were lining up, one after another, like files finally put in order. I knew something important then. People don't react when you're hurt. They sympathize. They soothe. They wait for you to calm down. They react when you stop protecting them. That understanding didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel sober. There would be consequences, questions, pushback. I could already imagine the confusion on his face, the way he'd say, "You're overthinking this," or "Why are you making it complicated?" I wasn't making anything complicated. I was making it visible. I started the car and drove back toward the hotel, the road stretching ahead of me, steady and unremarkable. For the first time, I wasn't wondering what he would do next. I was focused on what I would no longer do for him, until I realized he had already started doing things to me. It began small. A voicemail from a mutual friend I hadn't spoken to in months. Her tone was friendly, but clipped. She said she was just checking in because she heard things were tense. Tense? That word had the weight of someone else's version of my life hanging on it. The missed calls came next, familiar names from our circle. But nobody left a message, just the echo of curiosity or, worse, judgment. Then the silence started to change. It wasn't the kind of quiet that wraps you in peace. It was the type that warns you. People are talking, and you're not in the room. A week had passed since I paused the BMW delivery. Since I walked into that law office and began quietly severing the tangle of paperwork we called a life. I hadn't spoken to him, not once, but clearly he'd started speaking. That morning, I returned to the house briefly, just to grab one last box of documents I hadn't sorted. I parked 2 houses down, trying not to attract attention. I'd grown used to avoiding unnecessary noise. As I stepped out of the car, I saw her, Linda, our next-door neighbor, retired school teacher. Kept a garden of roses so precise it looked like it belonged in a magazine. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She walked straight over. "I don't want to get in the middle," she said, hands clasped in front of her. "But you should know. He's been saying you had a breakdown." I stared at her, blinking once. "He told people you weren't well," she went on, her voice low. "That you needed rest, space, time to sort yourself out." I exhaled slowly through my nose, not shocked, just tired. She glanced around, then added, "That doesn't sound like you, Charla. I told him that." I gave her a small nod. "Thank you for telling me." And then I left. Back in the car, I sat still for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just stared at the dashboard, thinking about how fast people accept the version that costs them the least discomfort. It was easier to believe I'd unraveled than to ask what could make someone like me walk away silently after 22 years. I felt the urge, brief but strong, to call someone, to explain, to say, "That's not what happened," or "Here's the truth." but I didn't. Because I knew it wouldn't matter. Not yet. People choose their stories the same way they choose their furniture. Comfort first. That afternoon, I went back to the hotel and sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by folders. Bank statements, deeds, tax returns, credit lines. For the first time, I wasn't just scanning them. I was naming things. This wasn't an argument. This was betrayal. Not the kind you apologize for, the kind you orchestrate. And I'd spent too long calling it anything but what it was. I whispered it out loud, just once. Betrayal. It didn't echo. It settled. Later that evening, I logged into our joint accounts. I started the process of separating everything that could be separated. I moved what I was legally entitled to. I notified institutions to flag certain transactions. I changed passwords, removed autopays, and created new paper trails. Not to punish him, to protect myself, to stop financing the story he was telling behind my back. Each click felt like a stitch being pulled out of old fabric. Quiet, precise, final, no warning, no grand declaration, only truth, executed quietly. When I was done, I walked downstairs to the vending machine in the lobby. Bought a bottle of water. On my way back up, I passed a couple arguing by the elevator. They lowered their voices as I approached. I didn't look at them. But in that moment, I realized something. I hadn't raised my voice in weeks. And yet, I'd said more than I ever had. That night, lying in bed with the TV on mute, I felt a strange calm settle over me. But it wasn't peace. It was preparation. The kind that comes before a storm, when the birds go silent and even the air waits. I knew he wouldn't let go without resistance. People like him don't lose quietly. They push back when they feel the control slipping. And I had just taken the wheel. What I didn't realize was how quickly they would try to grab it back. My phone lit up before sunrise. Not a call, 3 notifications stacked on top of each other. An email marked urgent. A text that said, "We need to talk." And a missed call from a number I didn't recognize, but somehow already knew. The tone was different now. No confusion, no pretending to be concerned. It carried confidence, almost relief, like they believed the ground had finally shifted in their favor. I sat up in bed, the hotel room still dim, the air heavy with that early morning quiet that usually feels peaceful. This time, it didn't. It felt like a warning. By mid-morning, I understood what they'd done. A friend forwarded me an email thread I hadn't been included in. My name appeared again and again, paired with words like volatile, vindictive, emotionally unstable. Screenshots followed, text messages I'd sent months earlier, lifted out of context and stitched together to look like something else entirely. A draft statement, a timeline, even a suggestion that I was acting out of spite over misunderstood circumstances. This wasn't gossip. It was a strategy. They weren't trying to hurt my feelings. They were trying to shape the record. I felt the first surge of disbelief rise in my chest, sharp and instinctive. Then it settled into something colder. Focus. I printed everything and spread it across the small desk in the room. Page by page, I read what they'd built. And that's when I saw it. In their effort to box me in, they'd been careless. Dates overlapped, phrases repeated, timelines aligned too neatly. In explaining why I was acting the way they claimed, they'd outlined exactly when decisions were made, before anything had supposedly gone wrong, before any breakdown, before any justification they were offering. They hadn't just accused me, they'd confessed, not loudly, not intentionally, but clearly enough for anyone trained to read between lines. I didn't respond right away. That was the hardest part, doing nothing when every nerve wanted to react. I let the silence stretch. Hours passed, then a day. I ignored follow-up messages and let the pressure build on their end instead of mine. During that pause, I made one call. Just one. And scheduled a meeting in a small conference room I'd already used once before. Neutral, professional, quiet. When the day came, I arrived early, parked, sat in my car with my hands on the steering wheel until my breathing evened out. I wasn't angry anymore. I was steady. Inside the room, I laid out my documents carefully. Titles, deeds, records with dates that didn't bend. Signatures that told the truth even when people didn't. When they walked in, I didn't greet them warmly. I didn't greet them coldly either. I simply nodded and waited. They spoke first, confident, measured, rehearsed. I listened without interrupting. Then, when the room finally went quiet, I slid one folder forward, then another. I pointed to nothing. I raised my voice for nothing. I let the paperwork do what it was meant to do. For a moment, just a moment, I placed the BMW key fob on the table, not as a gift, not as leverage, just as a marker of intent. Then I picked it up and put it back in my pocket. The air changed. No one apologized. No one admitted anything. But the certainty drained out of the room. I could feel it. The balance had shifted, and everyone knew it. When the meeting ended, I stood, gathered my things, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the sun was high. The day carried on like it always does. Cars passing, people moving, the world indifferent to private wars. They thought this was the end. For me, it was the beginning of breathing again. The morning after that meeting felt like stepping into a different atmosphere. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. I opened my eyes slowly and didn't feel pulled in 10 directions. There were no messages blinking on my phone, no cold pressure in my chest. The silence in the hotel room didn't feel ominous. It felt earned. There was space in my day, space in my head. I made coffee and didn't drink it right away. I just sat and noticed how my body felt lighter before my mind could catch up. Later that afternoon, I parked my car on a quiet street. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. No music played. The windows were half down. The kind of stillness that might make some people uncomfortable, especially those who run from their thoughts. But I didn't move. I stayed right there. And then I cried. Not the kind of crying that wrecks you. Not sobbing into a pillow or crumpled on the bathroom floor. I cried the way women cry when the storm has passed, but the debris is still all around them. One clean wave, then a breath. It wasn't for him. It wasn't for her. It was for the version of me that had swallowed things for too long. The woman who thought silence meant strength. The one who stayed because she was afraid she wouldn't survive the letting go. I wiped my cheeks with the back of my hand and didn't apologize to myself for it. A few days later, I went back to the house, one last time. It wasn't symbolic. I didn't walk in expecting to be haunted by memories. I wasn't there to feel anything. I needed to close accounts, physically and emotionally. I walked from room to room with a clipboard in hand, checking off things for the movers, noting repairs, and opening windows just enough to let the stale air out. Nothing inside those walls pulled at me. The kitchen that once held Sunday pancakes and quiet resentment. The hallway where I once overheard whispers that would reshape everything. The master bedroom, ours once, that had become cold long before anyone admitted it. I didn't let the memories set in. I just saw walls, floors, paint. Inventory, not emotion. That house didn't own me anymore. Not the keys, not the mortgage, not the illusion. His birthday came and went the following week. There was no reminder on my phone, but I knew the date anyway. I didn't send a message. I didn't buy a card. I didn't even speak his name aloud. I just lived that day like any other. For the first time in over 20 years, I didn't give energy to someone who never knew how to hold it. It didn't feel petty. It didn't feel triumphant either. It felt finished. A few more weeks passed before the final meeting. The office was neutral, not fancy, just clean and quiet. A receptionist offered water. I declined. I sat in the chair across from the attorney, her eyes kind, her tone even. She laid the final document in front of me. No preamble, no speech. Just a line that read, "Proceed." I signed. The pen didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel victorious either. Just steady, grounded, present. When it was over, I walked out into the late afternoon sun, not knowing exactly what came next, but knowing I could choose it. That was enough. Back at my rental car, I opened the center console and pulled out the last item from my old life that still carried any weight: the keys. The originals, not duplicates, not backups. The set I'd held since the very beginning. I sat with them for a while, turned them in my hand, let their cold edges press into my palm. Then I set them down on the table in front of me, not in anger, not as a statement, just down. No part of me wanted to hold them anymore. No part of me needed to. They had done their job, and I had done mine. The wound was still there. I didn't pretend otherwise. You don't go through betrayal and loss and years of self-sacrifice without scar tissue. But it didn't control me now. I could look at it and not flinch. I could name it without choking on the words. I didn't need to explain it to anyone or justify how long it took me to finally say, enough. I stepped out into a life that was mine again, not because it had been returned to me, but because I reclaimed it. Not defined by what I endured, not shaped by who left or how they did it. Defined by choice, by clarity, by quiet courage. There are endings that feel like loss, and there are endings that finally tell the truth.